Hi again, everyone, and welcome to On the Call with Jeff Rimmer, presented by Byers. And for me, a real treat today as we visit with the winningest coach in the history of the National Hockey League, not to mention 9 Stanley Cups, which is a National Hockey League record. Scotty Bowman, thanks for joining us. And first and foremost, how are you doing?
Well, pretty good, Jeff. I made a move about a week ago. As you know, I was down in Sarasota, so trying to get back to East Amherst. Usually you get back about after the playoffs in May, but we did something different. My wife and I, we decided we took the auto train. It was good. We went up to Euro Stampede grounds around Lorton, Virginia, and drove home. So we're back in East Amherst. They're opening up everything on Wednesday. We're in a good spot right now. I mean, not everything full, but they're going to open up the restaurants partial, and I understand the golf courses, things like the clubhouse, but very slowly. Governor Cuomo's been, he's been under the gun here, but he's pretty careful with what's going on.
That's great. I did a little research over the weekend, and incredibly, you have coached 42, count them, 42 Hall of Famers. I mean, wow. What a career.
Yeah, I was pretty fortunate, Jeff. You're right. I mean, Hall of Fame players, they like you mentioned, there's not, it's a tough thing to get into, but I was fortunate. Got a good start with St. Louis, as you know, and you know some of the players, but I've always talked about the Blues and what Glenn Hall really meant to that franchise. I mean, other players were terrific too, like Al Arbor and Red Berenson and Jimmy Roberts, guys like that. And then along came Dickie Moore and Doug Harvey and getting Jacques Plante. So, for an expansion team, we had 4 Hall of Fame players. And granted, they weren't in their prime, but they meant a lot to that franchise, getting off to a decent start. And getting the chance to get back to Montreal was certainly, looking back on it, it was a tough decision for me to leave St. Louis, but things got out of hand a little bit, and I look back at the Blues, and it's amazing. Jimmy Devellano was our area scout with Toronto, and we had Gary Darling, the late Gary Darling, who became assistant GM, with Philadelphia. And we had a lot of people that and Cliff Fletcher was with me from my first day there. So we had a lot of players, a lot of people and Al Arbor. I mean, when you look at that through the career, and Red Berenson, we had so many, the Plaguers. We had so many people that that just clicked on that team, and it was a tough thing for me to leave the area. My wife was from there. We just had a young girl, born a little baby the year before, but all of a sudden in the 4th year things fell apart. I reluctantly made a trade. Looking back, I probably would have stood up a little more, but we did so well the first 3 years, as you know, to get into the finals. And in the 4th season, I don't know, somehow the owner of the team, late Sid Solomon Jr., I got along very well with him, but somehow he was pretty determined to trade Red Berenson. And I told him what I thought. I said, it's not we had just lost three times in a row. You could imagine we lost to Montreal twice, and then of course the famous goal that Bobby Orr scored to Boston. But I mean, they were dynasty teams, so I thought we did okay. But he was anxious, and one day came to me, the owner, and his son was working with me too. But it was the father who came to me and said, is this team presently? Can this team that's constituted win the Stanley Cup? And obviously we were getting older. And I said, no, we have to do some rebuilding. And that's when he wanted, for some reason, he had a disagreement about something with Red Berenson. And he came back. It's an interesting story. He came back. It would be in our 4th season, maybe around the beginning, maybe around the beginning of January. And he went to a governor's meeting and he came back and he said, what do you think of Bernie Perrant? And I said, Bernie Perrant, I mean, I said, he's going to be the franchise right now with Philadelphia. They got probably, I think when you look at the expansion, the Flyers, they clicked on a great young goalie, and he was young. We all got decent NHL players, but they were veterans. So I said, they wouldn't trade him. Oh yeah, they'd make the deal. Well, I knew Keith Allen from days in Montreal, because when I was with the juniors and scouting, Sam Pollock would have extra players, and Keith ran a team out in Spokane. And when we would get extra pros, he would move them around, and he'd get sponsored teams. But those teams didn't want to sponsor junior teams, so I knew Keith Allen. He used to come to training camps, and I made the call one day, and I said, Keith, I understand that you're interested in Red Barons, and he said, absolutely. And then I said, he said, why? I said, well, I told him the story, and he said, are you drinking something? That's what he told me. I said, no, but I said, I'm obligated to call you. And he said, no, we're not. He's going to be he's going to be our franchise, which he was. So he came back a couple of weeks later, and then he mentioned he must have been talking to somebody in Detroit at a governor's meeting, and he said, what do you think of Gary Unger? I said, I like Gary Unger. He's 22 years old. I said, he's a different kind of player. He's going to be a good player, going to be better than a lot that we have. But I said, he doesn't have playoff experience. And I said, we were still a good team. We were still the fourth year of expansion. The league added Buffalo and Vancouver. And what happened is one of the Eastern teams had to come into the West, and it was Chicago. And they were, if you look at the Blackhawks at that time, they were right hitting their stride. I mean, they had Hull and Makita. They'd won the Cup in '61, 7 years earlier, but they still were a good team. And they came in and they dominated the West. But we were still number one of the other six, the original expansion. So I said to him, I said, Mr. Solomon, it's a deal that you can, 10 years from now, you could look at it, it'll be a good deal. But I said, it's going to hurt us in the playoffs, as long as you know that. I said, we still got a pretty good shot of somebody, Chicago might lose somewhere. We were going to finish second. And he said, well, I don't care about the playoffs. I want to build a team. Well, what happened is we made the trade. Red went to Detroit. They weren't a very strong team at the time. And Gary Unger came with us, and it wasn't Gary's fault. He was a young player with no playoff experience, and we got beat. We got beat by Minnesota. It was a bit of an upset. They were a pretty decent team, but we got beat. And then all hell broke loose. Losing that series and coming home, and then he just told me, father never talked to me like this, and said, you got 4 problems on the team. Cliff Fletcher is not what we're looking for, and Al Arbour will never be a coach. And because I put Al Arbour in as a coach and a trainer, and I said, well, and I made it was maybe a bit of a mistake. I said, Mr. Solomon, it's very simple. If they go, I go. And I had 37 months left on a contract. I had just earned a contract from the previous years, and it's funny. I went home that day, Jeff, and I said to my wife, I said, I don't know. I said, things are not like they used to be here. And she said, what do you mean? I said, I think we might have to go. And his son phoned me that night and said, he said, Scotty, nobody talks to my father the way you did. And he said, you've resigned your job. I said, I didn't resign. I told him he said, well, I said, I'm not going to tell those people. I said, I can't operate without those guys. And he also said that Glenn Hall had slipped, which he had a little bit, but still a good goalie. So I didn't know I was in a dilemma. And I called Clarence Campbell, the president, and I said, Mr. Campbell, I want to tell you what happened. And I said, I need some help. And I didn't have an agent or anything. And I told him the story. And he said, well, I'll put on my lawyer's hat and I'll take off my president's hat. And he said, I can tell you this. I'll give you some good advice. First of all, a resignation is not valid unless it's committed in writing and accepted and signed by both parties. But he said, on the other hand, it's not going to work out. He said, you better get your hands on the best lawyer you can, because he said it was a verbal statement you made, and of course the rest is history. And that's how I left.
Well, you and I first came in contact with each other in Montreal, and those were great years, the late 70s, 4 straight Stanley Cups, and incredibly, that one season, including the playoffs, your team lost only 8 games. That was quite a season and quite a hockey team.
Yeah, Montreal had been, the era, you were in Montreal, Jeff, and the era before me, I've always been amazed. They've talked about all the dynasties, which we know Detroit in the 50s, and Montreal, of course, 5 in a row. Toronto, I mean, usually the dynasty was at least 3 wins in a row. But when Sam Pollock took over as manager, he was virtually running the organization through most of the early 60s. He had a good relationship with the late Frank Selke, who was the general manager, and Kenny Reardon. And Sam, the Canadians went in a bit of a slump, as people know, in the early 60s. They won the 5 in a row. They finished first the next year as well, and that's the year Chicago came on and won the cup in '61. And then they had 3 tough years. Toronto were coming up with veteran players. Punch Imlach was a great hockey man. They won in '62, '63, '64. And then Canadians put Sam Pollock in as general manager. And the 4 or 5 years he won the cup in '65 and '66. And '67 was it's supposed to be a big win for Montreal. They were still the best team. Toronto upset them. That's the last win, of course, the Leafs had. And then he won in '68, '69. So that team that won, they nearly won 5 in a row. They won 4 out of 5, but there was no big name. I mean, there was Beliveau and Henri Richard, but there was a lot of workman-like type players, and some at the end of their careers, not Hall of Fame players, but there was some young ones coming on, like Serge Savard, Jacques Lemaire, Yvan Cournoyer. But that 4 wins in 5 years, 5 years, that team never got the credit that people talked about. But they did lose, as you know, Jeff. I think were you in Montreal when they missed the playoffs? Was that in? They must have missed in '70. I guess the year that the Bruins won. Is that it? I think so.
That's the year.
69, 70 when they won the cup in 68, 69 and didn't make the playoffs in 1970. And I was very fortunate. I mean, Sam had called me and said they were making changes. Al McNeil, a good friend of mine, he just had enough. He won the cup, and they had that big controversy with Henri Richard, and Al was from Sydney, Nova Scotia. The Canadians had a farm team. He said, look, I want to go home to Maritimes. And he did a tremendous job for Canadians, coaching 2 or 3 American League championship. So I got fortunate. I took over a team that had won the cup, but big upset when they beat, that was the Ken Dryden, win against Boston in '71.
Now, after that, it was on to Pittsburgh. And boy,
well, you missed Buffalo.
No, Buffalo was an interesting time for you there. But in fact, if you want to talk about Buffalo, by all means.
Well, people kid me. People kid me here, Jeff, because oddly enough, I moved to Buffalo 40 years ago, and we've through travels to Pittsburgh and Detroit, and it's still our home. I mean, Florida's our residence, but we come back for 4 months every year. We come back usually around May, and they said that's the only place. They're still looking for a win here. And and my friends that I play golf a bit with, they kid me. They said, "What happened in Buffalo?" And I said, "You tell me." But we built a pretty decent team, but we didn't have many veterans on the team. In fact, we drafted 2 Hall of Fame players. We drafted Phil Housley and Dave Andrechuk, But we you know, when I look at my days in Buffalo, Montreal was still a strong team. After I left in '79, they still had you know, Gainey's and Robinson, guys like that. They had a pretty good team, but you know, they won again in '86, I think. But you know, Buffalo, we were against Quebec was really coming on with the Stastnys and Goulet. Boston had Borks and Neelys, and you know, we did okay, but we couldn't do it in the playoffs. I mean, looking back on my career, it's so hard for a young team to win that cup. Jeff. It seems that you have to have we had enough adversity, but we didn't have enough the mid-range players, maybe, as you know, the ones that can lead your team. We didn't have enough of that.
Got to talk about Pittsburgh, and obviously Lemieux and Yager, a 1-2 punch really doesn't get any better than that.
Yeah, Craig Patrick called me. I was wondering about what I was going to do, and he called me and offered me the chance to stay at home and not have my kids were all in high school. It would have been a tough move to. I talked to New York about going to the Rangers. I talked to Quebec when I was in limbo for about 3 years, but then when I got a chance to go back in with Pittsburgh, I remember the press conference like yesterday. I had met him before, but we both got announced. The late Bob Johnson, he didn't get as much credit as building a team, and he came in from a team that had missed the playoffs and won the Stanley Cup. But Craig made tremendous trades. The trade he made the first year when he picked up Ronnie Francis and Ulf Samuelsson, and then the next year picking up Rick Tocchet and Shel Samuelsson, he made two deadline deals. I would think of all the deadline deals, I've always felt the one that Bill Torrey made and got Butch Goring is probably at the top of the heap. For a player that became a really, really, really perfect fit for the Islanders. They won 4 in a row with Butch, but I think when you look back at Pittsburgh, I don't know. I think we had 7 or 8 Hall of Fame players there. When you think about, we had Larry Murphy eventually made the Hall of Fame, and we had Joey Mullen was a terrific trade for Craig to make with Calgary, and like you said, drafting Jaromir Jagr, Ronnie Francis. Anytime you make a trade and you get a Hall of Fame player, you've got to really be fortunate. And our goaltender Tommy Barrasso, he's another player that I think is he's always been looked upon as a bit of a problem, but he was no problem in Pittsburgh. He won 2 cups and was very strong. So the Pittsburgh team, Mario and when I look at the playoff stats, I couldn't believe it one time. I looked, Jeff, in 2 seasons, 91, 92, Mario got 75 points in 2 playoffs. He got 42 points the first year with Bob Johnson, and then when I was there, he got 34 points. He just was a scoring machine. I saw Mario play when he was, I think he was 13 or 14, and there was a fellow in Montreal named Bob Beal, and he started he used to bring teams in from different places in Quebec, minor teams, like kids teams. And they used to play on Saturday afternoon at the Forum. It was called a foreign exchange program. Bob Beal ran it, and I went, and he used to ask me, would you like to come and watch some games? So we played Saturday nights. After the skate in the morning, I'd hang around. At 1 o'clock, they'd have these teams came down from Quebec City, northern Quebec. And one time, some team came back down from the Saguenay, north of Quebec City, and this player was playing for Villemard. It was Mario Lemieux, and he was 6'2", and he was about 13 years old. The only other player that I've seen more than that, but there's only one other player that I saw at the same age that I was just astonished. And of course, we talked about it before, Bobby Orr. I saw Bobby Orr playing Gananoque. Did I ever tell you that story about Bobby?
No, you did not.
Well, this is interesting. I coached Peterborough, And then Canadians said, "No, we want you to be the head scout for Eastern Canada." I took the job for 3 years. I didn't like the job. I was not even in my late 20s. It wasn't a job for a young person like me, but I did it. And I was living in Ottawa, and I was living with a bunch of football players. I wasn't married, and I was living with Kay Vaughn and Jill Archambault, and it was a boarding house right near the arena, and they played with the Rough Riders. They were in their prime, and the man that ran the boarding house, his name was Bert Clark, and he only knew about football. One Saturday afternoon, I was going to a game in Gananoque, Ontario. It was Parry Sound. They were in the sea because of the population, and they played against the team in Gananoque, and it was a final. So it would be bantam. And I said to this Bert Clark, "Would you like to take a drive with me?" It was a beautiful Saturday afternoon. Bobby had just turned, I think he had just turned 13 because his birthday was in March, and it was in March. And I brought Bert Clark along, and there was two players on the other team, Gananoque. It was the number, everybody was after them. It was a number 8. There was one guy named Ricky Eaton, and the other guy, number 17, Doug Higgins. And I said, "Look, I give Bert Clark, watch these two players, number 8 and number 17. And Bobby Orr, everybody knew of him, and they knew that Boston was first in to see him. And and that day, Weston Adams, Milt Schmidt, Ren Blair, 3 or 4 big guys from Boston were at the same game. And anyways, the game started, and we were about 5-6 minutes into the game, and I said to my friend Bert Clark, he said, and he knew nothing about hockey. To remind you that he's only a football guy. He said, "Scotty, I think you should forget about those two and look at number 2." And Bobby he was about 5'3", and I mean he was unbelievable. He was 13 years old. I often kid Bobby about that. I said, "I think I saw you after your 13th birthday." So Mario would be about the same, and those players. How many can you be so fortunate to see as great as they are? Were.
Detroit, it changed the culture, got that team over the hump. The Russian 5 was put together. You had Lidstrom on the blue line. You had Yzerman up front. Just a team loaded. And again, we go back to Hall of Famers, several on that hockey team.
Yeah, Jimmy DeVillano called me, and he said they were making a change, and I'm pretty sure he had first talked to, because he was very close with the Islanders, and I think he'd called Al Arbor first, and Al didn't want to ever leave New York. I've always been admired about 2 coaches, Al Arbor and Don Shula. I said, of all the coaches of all the sports, I mean, there's been some other ones, but 2 guys that did so much for one team. They didn't go anywhere. They just stayed with the same team. But so he called me up and he said, "We're looking for a coach." And Mike Ilitch came to Buffalo with Mary and his wife. They picked up myself and my wife and my four kids and brought me on their plane to Florida. And we talked one Sunday afternoon, and I didn't even have to sign a contract. I knew right away I wanted to go there. And he was so impressive. And, he said, "We have a good team, but I really want to win the Stanley Cup." And he said, I know I got some good young players, but he said, the time frame isn't always isn't as long as you think it is. So he'd be the one, the late Mike Ilitch. Whoever the people that scouted those players, I'm pretty sure Kenny Holland was in on them, because he was a scout from Western Canada, and there was a scout from Sweden named Christer Rockstrom. He later went to the Rangers. He's the one that got Nick Lidstrom. He probably was instrumental in them. And, Jimmy would be the architect, Jimmy DeVillano. He took the chances that nobody ever drafted Russian players in the late 80s, because it's like a waste of a draft pick. And he picked Konstantinov, he picked Fedorov, he picked Kozlov. He didn't, somebody must have picked them, but he took the chance on them. And Jimmy Lights was the president of the team, and that's all in that movie. The Russian 5 was an amazing movie, and I was there. We did make trades though. We traded to get we traded a good player, Ray Shepard, but we had about 5 right wingers. We got the big piece was getting both Igor Larionov and Slava Fetisov, because Sergei Fedorov and Konstantinov were really, they were established. But to get those veteran Soviet players, and then young Kozlov came along too. But it seemed every year that we needed players when there was some on the market. And then even at the end of my career in Detroit, Kenny Holland was the general manager. And, all of a sudden he'd call me up in the summer and say, I think we're going to get Luke Robitaille. Another time he said, we're going to get Brett Hull. And it seemed everybody he wanted to go after, like he'd offer them a good contract. But that with Steve Yzerman and Fedorov, to me the teams, it's no different than it was. We were always in a fight with Colorado. They had Joe Sakic and Peter Forsberg. And you look at Pittsburgh now, they've got Crosby and Malkin. They've had a decade of those two guys, winning cups and always being pretty close. And if you get your hands on two centermen, if they're two great players, and if they're both centermen, you got such a leg up. And that's what we had in Detroit, And the other part of I look at that team, and it also happened in Montreal, is your star players can put you over the top, but all of those teams seemed, when I got to Montreal, we were close at the beginning, not good enough, and then we all of a sudden we brought up two young kids from our farm team that just started in the minors, Doug Risebrough and Mario Tremblay, and put them with another player that Sam Pollock had picked up, Yvan Lambert. They were a grinding line. They were not Hall of Fame players, but they just fit in so perfectly. And then Detroit getting a line of Chris Draper and Kirk Maltby, and first guy was Darren McCarty, and then later on came Joey Kosar. But those role players on teams, to me, can often tip the difference. And when I looked at that 1970 team of Bobby Orr scoring that goal that beat the Blues, and I was coaching, and that line of Derek Sanderson and Eddie Westfall, and they had later on Don Marcotte, but they had a lot of Hall of Fame players on those teams too. But those grinding players, if you don't have them, you're not going to win.
For sure. Got a couple of quick questions for you, and I can't let you go without talking about the Columbus Blue Jackets.
Sure.
You spent time in Tampa, spend the winters there. That's your home residence. And last spring, Tampa, after 62 victories, played the Blue Jackets. Did you expect that? And what did you think about the series at the end?
Well, when I first went to Tampa, or to Sarasota, after I retired, I made myself a Florida resident in 2005. And I got to watch the Lightning play. And of course, as you know, your coach, John Tortorella, won the cup with the Lightning. And I remember in that summer, John calling me up and saying, "Would you like to come to a fishing derby in Tampa?" And I went right the year they won the Stanley Cup. It must have been 06, I guess. Is that 06 or 05? I'm not sure. One of the two. The Lightning won under John Tortorella. But he invited me down, and no, I was totally surprised. I was at the game. I was at game one. I was at game two when they lost. They were down 3-0. But they didn't let it slip away. But the Blue Jackets came back. And when they won game two, it became a series. And they came back in game one, and then winning another game in Tampa. When you get a good team like the Lightning, all of a sudden they're shocked, in disbelief. But I've seen it happen, Jeff. When you have no adversity, that team rolled along the last 2 weeks of the season. They hardly lost a game the last month, but no adversity. And boy, when adversity hits you and you're playing a team like the Blue Jackets, they were stingy. They took all the ice time, the ice space away from the Lightning, and all of a sudden the Lightning couldn't do what they did during the season. And that was one of the big upsets. I mean, I had a big upset against me in Detroit San Jose. But that one there, I mean, Lightning 60 something, 62 wins and getting blown out. And they recovered pretty well. There's going to be some, if this thing comes back, Jeff, which is, I guess it's 50-50 or maybe 60-40, but probably will come back sometime if things get better, in the world. And I think it's going to be quite a series. I really do. And you play, the Blue Jackets would play Toronto.
Yeah, what do you think about that series?
Well, Toronto has had some adversity. The thing that this is going to be what they've done up to this point. To me, you could throw out the window because the teams are going to be healthy. The Blue Jackets, I wouldn't have given them a big chance without Seth Jones. I mean, Seth Jones is terrific defenseman. And, you're thinking about a guy that's going to log 25, 28 minutes a game. Now, I understand he's going to be 100%, isn't he?
Yeah.
So the teams that had injuries, down the stretch, they're going to have all their players back. The Lightning are going to get their players. They had 3 or 4 working out. Stamkos, McDonough, Hedman got hurt the last game in Detroit, and they'll have all those players back. So it's going to be an awesome playoff if they get to it. It's going to be so different without the crowds. And I think the unknown, the unseen hand, I guess, as they call it, is going to be a big factor in this run coming up.
Got to ask you here in closing, sticking with the Blue Jackets here now, you in Montreal, in the years that we were there together, you had the big three, Robinson, Savard, and Guy Lapointe. The Blue Jackets, and I make a comparison, certainly they've got a long way to go. We're talking about 3 Hall of Famers. But when you have the top 3 of Werenski, Seth Jones, and when healthy, Ryan Murray, not to mention David Savard, a strong defensive defenseman, that's a pretty good nucleus on the blue line.
Defense in the playoffs is crucial. There's not a team that can – and in today's game, too, if you don't have mobility in the back end, and defensemen today that can play both ways are just they're so hard to find. And you're exactly right. We had some good teams against us in Montreal, but we never had a team that could match up on defense. And when you get into playoffs now, your defensemen are going to play 25 minutes a game, especially in there's a lot of ways now. The game is fast, but there's a lot of ways that players take short shifts. They jump on, they jump off. So I don't think it'd be a problem getting a defenseman. We had the luxury in Detroit. The same thing with Nick Lidstrom. He logged 25, 28 minutes a game. We had Larry Murphy, who we got from Toronto. He did the same thing. So when you look back at the winning teams in hockey, if it goes on your defense. And I agree. The teams are all going to be healthy. You hope they stay healthy. That's going to be the big issue in this entire, procedure to stay healthy.
Well, I can't thank you enough for this visit. Enlightening as always, Scotty. Stay healthy. And I look forward to seeing you in an arena in front of fans real soon.
Thank you, Jeff. And it's going to be exciting if everything falls into place. There's a lot of hurdles, as we know, to try to accomplish. And they're working feverishly to get it done. And I just hope there's not a setback because, you keep looking around and I'm not, you're never comfortable now. I'm much more comfortable here in my own home, living in East Amherst. But at the same time, I'm looking around and we don't know these places that are opening up, and you don't like to see what's happening in the world today. But we just have to look ahead and be positive as much as we can. And I thank you very much, and I enjoyed it.
The Hall of Famer, Scotty Bowman, 9-time Stanley Cup champion, and yes, the winningest coach in the history of the game. That's it. Glad you've joined us here for On the Call. I'm Jeff Rimmer. It's presented by Byers. Have a great day.